Ladies and gentlemen, when we hear the words Supermax prison, we often imagine extreme isolation, rigid control, and the most dangerous offenders. But rarely do we ask an equally important question: how did inmates actually end up there? Today, I want to take you inside the Illinois CMAX system and reveal how prisoners were really transferred into Tamms Correctional Center, one of the most controversial Supermax prisons in American history. Tamms was designed to house individuals deemed the worst of the worst. Officially, inmates were transferred there for serious disciplinary violations, assaults on staff, gang leadership, or repeated disruptive behavior. On paper, the process appeared structured, fair, and rooted in security concerns. In reality, however, the transfer system was far more opaque and deeply flawed. Inmates were often transferred to Tamms without a new criminal conviction. Instead, decisions were made through internal prison hearings where the accused had limited access to evidence, no meaningful legal representation, and little ability to challenge accusations. Confidential informants, unverified intelligence, and vague allegations frequently played a decisive role. Once labeled a threat, an inmate could be sent to Tamms indefinitely. The transfer process itself was sudden and disorienting. Prisoners were often given little notice, shackled, transported under heavy security, and removed far from family and legal support. Upon arrival, they entered near total isolation, confined to their cells for 22 to 24 hours a day, with minimal human contact and severe restrictions on communication. What made Tamms especially controversial was not only the harsh conditions, but the lack of a clear path out. Inmates had no defined sentence length. Release from Tamms depended largely on subjective evaluations of behavior, often requiring compliance in an environment that many experts say exacerbated mental illness rather than corrective behavior. Over time, civil rights groups, psychologists, and former correctional staff raised alarms. They argued that the transfer system punished prisoners not for what they had done, but for what they were suspected of doing, or for being difficult, outspoken, or mentally ill. These concerns eventually led to lawsuits, public scrutiny, and a growing recognition that the Illinois CMAX system lacked transparency and accountability. In 2013, Tamms was finally closed, but its legacy remains a powerful reminder of how administrative decisions, made quietly and without oversight, can profoundly impact human lives. Understanding how inmates were transferred into Tamms is not just about history. It is about questioning how power is exercised within correctional systems and how justice should truly be defined. Tamms Correctional Center held a unique and powerful position within the Illinois Department of Corrections because it was the state's only supermaximum security prison, commonly referred to as a supermax. Unlike traditional maximum security prisons, Tamms was specifically designed to impose the highest level of control and isolation possible within the correctional system. Its purpose was not rehabilitation or reintegration, but containment. The facility was built to house inmates who prison officials classified as the most dangerous, disruptive, or unmanageable individuals in the entire state prison population. The physical structure of Tamms reflected this mission. Inmates were confined to single-person cells made of concrete and steel, designed to minimize interaction with others. Doors were electronically controlled, movement was tightly regulated, and surveillance was constant. Unlike other prisons where inmates might participate in group programs, work assignments, or recreation, Tamms operated on near-total isolation. Prisoners spent between 22 and 24 hours a day alone in their cells, with meals passed through slots and recreation occurring in small, enclosed yards that prevented contact with other inmates. Because Tamms was the only facility of its kind in Illinois, it became the final destination for inmates who were deemed too problematic for other prisons. This gave prison administrators extraordinary power, as a transfer to Tamms represented the most severe, non-judicial punishment available within the system. Being sent to Tamms meant removal from the general prison population and placement into conditions far harsher than those experienced elsewhere, even in maximum security institutions. The The existence of a single Supermax also meant that Tamms functioned as a centralized tool of control. The threat of transfer alone was often used to enforce compliance in other prisons. Inmates understood that Tamms was not just another prison, but an environment of extreme sensory deprivation, limited human contact, and indefinite confinement. This reputation reinforced its role as the most feared institution in the Illinois correctional system, shaping inmate behavior long before any actual transfer occurred. One of the most critical aspects of how inmates ended up at Tamms Correctional Center was that their transfer did not require a new criminal charge or conviction. Instead, transfers were carried out through an administrative process entirely controlled by the Illinois Department of Corrections. This meant that inmates could be moved to the state's harshest prison environment without appearing before a judge, without a jury trial, and without the legal protections normally associated with criminal punishment. The administrative transfer process was based on internal prison classifications rather than formal court proceedings. Prison officials reviewed an inmate's disciplinary record, alleged gang involvement, behavioral history, or perceived threat level. These determinations were often broad and subjective, allowing administrators significant discretion. An inmate could be labeled a security risk based on patterns of behavior, intelligence reports, or accusations that never resulted in formal charges. In many cases, the behavior cited had already been punished through segregation or loss of privileges, yet the transfer to Tamms imposed an additional, far more severe consequence. Unlike criminal convictions, which require evidence to meet a high legal standard, administrative transfers operated under a much lower threshold of proof. Decisions were frequently based on internal reports written by correctional staff, confidential informants whose identities were not disclosed, or alleged gang affiliations that inmates could not effectively dispute. Because the process was administrative, inmates had limited opportunities to challenge the accuracy of the information used against them or to present evidence in their defense. This system blurred the line between discipline and punishment. Although the state did not officially classify a transfer to Tamms as a new sentence, the reality was that inmates faced conditions dramatically more restrictive than those in other prisons. The absence of judicial oversight meant that decisions with life-altering consequences were made behind closed doors, governed by institutional priorities rather than legal accountability. As a result, administrative transfers became a powerful mechanism through which inmates could be subjected to extreme confinement without ever being convicted of an additional crime. The internal hearings used to justify transfers to Tamms Correctional Center were fundamentally different from formal court proceedings and offered inmates very limited protections. These hearings were conducted entirely within the prison system, overseen by correctional officials rather than independent judges. As a result, the process prioritized institutional control and security concerns over fairness, impartiality, or the rights of the accused inmate. Inmates facing transfer were typically notified that a review or hearing would take place, but they were not afforded the same due process rights guaranteed in criminal courts. They did not have access to legal representation, nor were they allowed to call witnesses or cross-examine those making accusations against them. The information presented during these hearings was often summarized rather than disclosed in full, leaving inmates unaware of the specific details or sources of the allegations being used to justify their transfer. A major issue with these hearings was the reliance on confidential evidence. Prison officials frequently cited intelligence reports, anonymous informants, or gang activity assessments that inmates were not allowed to see or challenge. Because the identities of informants were protected, inmates had no way to assess the credibility or motivations behind the accusations. This secrecy made it nearly impossible for prisoners to defend themselves or correct false or exaggerated claims. Transparency was further undermined by the lack of clear standards governing transfer decisions. Criteria for what constituted a sufficient threat to warrant placement in Tamms were often vague and inconsistently applied. Decisions were documented internally, but inmates received minimal explanations, and there was no meaningful external oversight or appeals process. Once a transfer was approved, it was extremely difficult to reverse, even if new information emerged or circumstances changed. The absence of due process within these hearings meant that inmates could be subjected to the most extreme form of confinement in the Illinois prison system based on untested allegations and closed-door decisions. The process functioned less as a fair evaluation and more as an administrative formality, reinforcing the imbalance of power between prison authorities and the individuals whose lives were profoundly altered by the outcome. A central feature of the transfer process into Tamms Correctional Center was the heavy reliance on confidential informants and unverified intelligence reports. Prison officials frequently justified transfers by citing information gathered through internal investigations, much of which was never independently confirmed. This intelligence often came from other inmates acting as informants, staff observations, or gang intelligence units that monitored perceived affiliations and communications within the prison system. Confidential informants played a particularly influential role. In many cases, inmates were accused of gang leadership, organizing violence, or planning disruptions based solely on statements made by unnamed sources. These informants were granted anonymity, supposedly for safety reasons, but this protection also shielded their claims from scrutiny. Inmates facing transfer were not told who accused them, what incentives the informants may have received, or whether the information had been corroborated. This created a system where accusations could be made with little accountability. Unverified intelligence compounded the problem. Prison administrators often relied on behavioral patterns, possession of certain symbols or literature, or association with specific individuals to infer gang involvement or security threats. Such indicators were frequently subjective and open to interpretation. An inmate could be labeled a danger based on assumptions rather than direct actions, even if no violent incident had occurred. Once recorded in internal files, these intelligence reports were treated as factual, despite the lack of independent verification. The inability of inmates to review or challenge this evidence made the process inherently one-sided. Because the information was classified as confidential, inmates were denied access to the very material used to justify their transfer. This secrecy prevented meaningful rebuttal and allowed potentially false or outdated information to follow inmates throughout their incarceration. Over time, these intelligence-based labels became self-reinforcing, increasing the likelihood of transfer to Tamms regardless of an inmate's current behavior or conduct. The actual transfer of inmates to Tamms Correctional Center was often abrupt and disorienting, leaving little time for preparation or understanding of what was happening. In many cases, inmates were informed of their transfer only hours, or even minutes, before it took place. This lack of notice prevented them from contacting family members, notifying attorneys, or mentally preparing for the extreme conditions they were about to face. Personal property was hastily packed by staff or left behind, adding to the sense of confusion and loss. Once the transfer was initiated, security procedures were intensified far beyond normal prison movement. Inmates were typically placed in full restraints, including handcuffs, waist chains, and leg irons, regardless of whether they had a history of violence. Multiple officers escorted each prisoner, emphasizing the perception that the individual posed an extraordinary threat. Transportation vehicles were often unmarked or heavily secured, and routes and schedules were kept confidential to minimize outside awareness. The journey itself reinforced the punitive nature of the transfer. Inmates were frequently transported long distances across the state, isolated from familiar surroundings and support networks. During transport, communication was minimal, and conditions were uncomfortable, sometimes lasting several hours. The process was designed not only to ensure security, but also to assert institutional authority, making it clear that the inmate was being moved into a category apart from the general prison population. Upon arrival at Tamms, the transition was immediate and severe. Inmates were processed quickly, subjected to strict searches, issued new uniforms, and placed directly into isolation cells. There was no gradual adjustment period or orientation to explain rules, expectations, or the duration of confinement. The suddenness of the transfer, combined with the overwhelming security measures, underscored that placement in Tamms was not merely a change in location, but a dramatic escalation in control and deprivation. Life inside Tamms Correctional Center was defined by extreme isolation that went far beyond the conditions found in other maximum security prisons. Inmates were confined to their cells for approximately 22 to 24 hours a day, with virtually no direct human contact. The cells were small, enclosed spaces constructed of concrete and steel, designed to limit sensory stimulation and interaction. Communication with other inmates was nearly impossible, and even routine contact with correctional staff was brief, impersonal, and conducted through solid doors or narrow slots. Daily activities that might break the monotony in other prisons were severely restricted. Meals were delivered through a slot in the cell door, eliminating face-to-face interaction. Recreation, when allowed, took place alone in small, enclosed yards often referred to as dog runs. The isolation extended beyond physical separation. Access to phone calls, visitation, and correspondence was tightly controlled, making it difficult for inmates to maintain relationships with family or legal counsel. Visits, when permitted, were often conducted through glass partitions, preventing physical contact and reinforcing emotional distance. For many inmates, the lack of regular communication contributed to feelings of abandonment and disconnection from the outside world. Mental health professionals and human rights advocates have long warned that prolonged isolation can have severe psychological effects. Inmates at Tamms frequently reported symptoms such as anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and difficulty concentrating. Rather than addressing these conditions, the structure of Tamms often intensified them, as isolation itself became both the environment and the punishment. The near-total separation from human interaction transformed daily existence into a cycle of silence, confinement, and sensory deprivation. One of the most troubling aspects of confinement at Tamms Correctional Center was the absence of a fixed or clearly defined length of stay. Unlike traditional prison sentences, which are determined by courts and include specific time frames, placement in Tamms was indefinite. Inmates were not told how long they would remain there, nor were they given a concrete timeline or measurable milestones that would lead to their release back into the general prison population. This uncertainty became a defining feature of life inside the facility. Decisions about how long an inmate stayed at Tamms were made through periodic administrative reviews conducted by prison officials. These reviews were largely discretionary and based on internal assessments of behavior, perceived attitude, and compliance with institutional rules. Because the criteria were vague and inconsistently applied, inmates often had little understanding of what was expected of them or how their actions would be evaluated. Even inmates who avoided disciplinary infractions for extended periods could remain confined without explanation. The lack of a fixed term created a psychological burden that many inmates described as more punishing than the physical conditions themselves. Without a clear endpoint, inmates struggled to maintain hope or a sense of progress. Time became abstract, measured not by meaningful events, but by repeated reviews that often resulted in continued confinement. The inability to plan for the future or anticipate release deepened feelings of helplessness and despair. This indeterminate system also concentrated power in the hands of prison administrators. Because release decisions were not tied to objective standards or external oversight, inmates were dependent on the subjective judgments of officials who controlled every aspect of their environment. The absence of a defined sentence transformed confinement at Tamms into an open-ended form of punishment, one where the duration was as isolating and destabilizing as the conditions themselves. Release from Tamms Correctional Center was not governed by a transparent set of rules or objective benchmarks, but instead depended on subjective behavior reviews conducted by prison officials. These reviews were intended to assess whether an inmate was suitable for transfer back to a lower security facility, yet the standards used to make these determinations were often unclear and inconsistently applied. Inmates were rarely provided with detailed explanations of what specific behaviors or improvements were required for release. Behavior reviews focused heavily on compliance, attitude, and perceived cooperation rather than measurable achievements. Because Tamms offered few programs, work assignments, or rehabilitative opportunities, inmates had limited ways to demonstrate positive change. Avoiding disciplinary infractions was often not enough. Officials could interpret silence, withdrawal, or emotional distress, common responses to prolonged isolation, as signs of continued instability or risk, further justifying continued confinement. The subjective nature of these evaluations meant that personal perceptions and institutional biases could significantly influence outcomes. An inmate's past reputation, alleged gang affiliation, or earlier disciplinary history often weighed more heavily than current conduct. Even when inmates maintained long periods of rule compliance, review boards could conclude that they had not sufficiently proven a change in mindset or threat level, without offering concrete reasons. This process left inmates trapped in a cycle where release depended on interpretations they could neither predict nor challenge. Without access to the evidence or rationale behind review decisions, inmates had no meaningful way to adjust their behavior to meet expectations. The reliance on subjective assessments, combined with the extreme isolation of Tamms, turned the review process into an opaque and unpredictable mechanism that prolonged confinement rather than providing a clear path toward reintegration. Tamms Correctional Center housed a significant number of inmates who already suffered from mental health conditions, yet the environment of the facility was poorly suited to address their needs. Rather than providing therapeutic care, the structure and daily operations of Tamms often intensified existing psychological issues. The extreme isolation, lack of stimulation, and minimal human interaction created conditions that mental health experts have long identified as harmful, particularly for individuals with depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, or trauma-related illnesses. Mental health services at Tamms were limited and frequently conducted through cell doors or brief encounters that lacked privacy and depth. Inmates often reported that evaluations were rushed and focused more on maintaining order than on meaningful treatment. Counseling sessions, when available, were constrained by security protocols that prevented sustained interaction. Medication was sometimes used as the primary response to psychological distress, without accompanying therapy or consistent monitoring. The prolonged isolation experienced by inmates frequently led to the development of new mental health symptoms. Individuals who entered Tamms without a diagnosed illness began to exhibit signs of emotional deterioration, including panic attacks, paranoia, hallucinations, and difficulty controlling thoughts or emotions. Sleep disturbances, self-harm, and suicidal ideation were also reported, reflecting the profound psychological strain imposed by the environment. Rather than recognizing these symptoms as indicators of harm, institutional responses often treated them as behavioral problems. Emotional breakdowns or expressions of distress could result in disciplinary action or further restrictions, reinforcing a cycle in which mental illness was punished rather than addressed. The conditions at Tamms blurred the line between security and care, creating an environment where psychological suffering was not only common but systematically intensified. Tamms Correctional Center operated for over 2 decades as Illinois' only Supermax prison, but mounting public scrutiny and legal challenges ultimately brought its closure in 2013. Civil rights organizations, mental health advocates, and investigative journalists played a pivotal role in exposing the systemic flaws within the Illinois CMAX system, particularly the arbitrary transfer process, extreme isolation, lack of due process, and the harmful effects on inmates' mental health. These groups documented individual cases, conducted interviews with former prisoners and correctional staff, and presented research showing that Tamms' operational methods violated basic human rights and often worsened inmates' conditions rather than improving safety or security. Legal challenges were a major factor in bringing Tamms under public scrutiny. Lawsuits filed on behalf of inmates argued that prolonged solitary confinement without clear criteria for release constituted cruel and unusual punishment, violating the Eighth Amendment. Courts examined claims that administrative transfers were made based on secret or unverified evidence, and that behavior reviews were arbitrary and inconsistent. Although some legal battles did not result in immediate policy changes, the accumulation of evidence and public pressure created a political and social climate that ultimately made maintaining the facility untenable. The closure of Tamms also highlighted systemic issues that extended beyond the prison itself. It prompted state officials, lawmakers, and advocacy groups to question the broader reliance on extreme isolation as a correctional tool. Critics emphasized that the Tamms system had concentrated excessive power in the hands of prison administrators, lacked transparency, and failed to provide meaningful oversight or rehabilitation opportunities. In addition, studies conducted after its closure revealed the long-term psychological impact on former inmates, reinforcing the argument that such confinement could inflict more harm than it prevented. The shutdown of Tamms marked a significant moment in the national conversation about Supermax prisons, solitary confinement, and prisoners' rights. It demonstrated that persistent advocacy, media attention, and legal intervention could challenge entrenched correctional practices. However, the closure also served as a reminder of how long systemic flaws can persist and the importance of sustained oversight to prevent similar abuses in other facilities or future iterations of Supermax systems. The story of Tamms Correctional Center serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences when extreme power is concentrated in the hands of a few and transparency is absent. While its closure marked a step toward reform, it also highlights the ongoing need for accountability, humane treatment, and oversight in correctional systems. By examining how inmates were transferred, confined, and evaluated, we gain critical insight into the human cost of administrative decisions and the importance of balancing security with justice, dignity, and compassion. Understanding Tamms is not just about the past. It is a call to ensure that the mistakes of Supermax confinement are never repeated.